You all still see the slide that I'm sharing? Yes, great.
Good evening, ladies. We're going to get started in a few moments. Good evening, ladies. It's 9:03. We're going to start in about 2 to 3 minutes. We are waiting for folks to join us on Zoom, and we are also live on YouTube. So folks will be joining us from YouTube as well. Thank you to those of you who are joining. We're going to start in a few minutes. We are waiting for
Mocha
more
Mom
folks to join.
mentality about policing.
I care about this country. I love this country, even though it's
All right, everybody, we're going to go ahead and start. I'd like to welcome you this evening. My name is Quay Kelch-Maddox. I'm the National President of Mocha Moms Incorporated. We are very happy to have you with us tonight. We know everyone is very busy and has quite a bit going on, but we have a very exciting, engaging conversation ahead of us, and we'd like to welcome all of you all. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce the members of our national board. First, I'd like to introduce Shelley English Figueroa.
Quay, you are muted. Can you unmute, please?
I am unmuted. First, I'd like to introduce Shelley English Figueroa. Shelley?
Hi, good evening, everyone. Again, I'm Shelley English Figueroa, and I am a co-founder of Mocha Moms, and I am the National President Emerita. Been here since the beginning, still here, happy to be here. Excited that you have joined us for this very important conversation. This is going to be a big one, so I'm looking forward to it. I hope you are too. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Shelley. I'd like to introduce LaShawn Martin, who's busy behind the scenes.
Quay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Hello, everyone. My name is LaShawn Martin. I am your National Vice President of Operations. I am thrilled for this conversation that we are going to have tonight with Dr. Tracy, and I'm happy to see all the Mochas joining, and I will be your support, your tech support on the back end. So just chat me if you have any concerns. We are live on YouTube, and we have also pushed to Facebook as well. So invite your friends and family to join the conversation.
Thanks so much, LaShawn. Is Kim Scott there? I can't quite see. It looks like we have 3 rooms. Is Kim here?
I'm here.
Okay, Kim, go
Hi,
for it.
I'm Kim Scott. I'm the National Treasurer of Mocha Moms. And I'd just like to say welcome to you all.
Thanks so much, Kim. Shalon, are you there? Not yet? Okay, we'll come back to Shalon. Tiffany Carr?
Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Tiffany Carr. I'm your National Director of Community Service. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. This is going to be such a great conversation tonight on policing. We look forward to hearing from our guest speaker tonight. So please stay tuned. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Tiffany. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce Dinae Eicher.
Good evening, everyone. I hope that everyone can hear me. Is that okay, LaShawn? Great. We were having some sound issues earlier. I am Denier. I am the National Director of Advocacy and Public Policy, a new title that I'm getting used to. Thank you, board. Appreciate it. And I am really, really, really looking forward to tonight's conversation. Quay, should we go ahead and get started?
Yes, I don't know if Shalon is on, but, and I don't know if Gabby is on, but I'd love to introduce our National Administrator, Gabriela Sanchez. Many of you all know her. She is our right-hand person for all things. And Gabby, if you're on, please say a little something. I don't know if she's on. No?
Come back to her, Quay.
Okay, will do. All right, Denier, take it away.
Great, thank you. I am so excited about tonight's meeting and tonight's guest. Shelley and I spoke with Dr. Tracy Kesey early on. So you all know that very first week that we were all stunned by the murder of George Floyd, we issued a letter to police, national police, and you all were issuing it locally. And we heard directly from the Center for Policing Equity and Dr. Tracy Kesey about the situation that we're all in. And I do want to be clear, this situation that we are all in is called systemic racism. I know people are having a hard time saying that, but that's what it is. And so we're going to talk about that in terms of policing today. But before we even get started, E.B., I see you. Thank you. E.B. Johnson is the president of the Burlington County, New Jersey Mochas. And that's the Mocha chapter there. And as you all know, we are sending out, we've asked you all local chapters to send out the letter to police to your local law enforcement agencies, your sheriff's offices, your local police chiefs, and those people are getting back to us. And it has been really, really interesting. And it happens that the Burlington County, New Jersey chapter is the first chapter to have met with local police. I do believe that Hollis Bergen County is up next. We'll be meeting with them next. We've even heard from police chiefs in Virginia. So this is moving forward, you all. But I wanted to give, I asked Abby if she could speak with us to talk very briefly about that chapter's experience meeting with police, telling them what we want to see as mothers of Black children in this country, and as the sisters and wives and daughters of people who are falling victim far too often of racialized policing violence, especially in this country. So Abby, you want to speak for a few minutes? You're muted though.
Can you hear me?
Yes, would you please introduce yourself and then go ahead and tell us your experience?
Sure. My name is Abby Johnson. I am the president of the Burlington County chapter of Mocha Moms in New Jersey. I believe a week ago, we met with the chief of police in our area, and this occurred after sending out the call to police letter. And we heard back from our chief of police within, I want to say, 48 hours. And he was very interested in meeting with us to de-escalate things and to work on a relationship between law enforcement and the Black community. And so my chapter members and Denier, we scheduled a meeting a week later, and we went into the meeting with the intention to find a way to work together. It wasn't an us versus them type of situation. We wanted to respect and to allow the officers to do their job successfully. And we want to also, in turn, raise our children successfully in the community. And so when we did begin the meeting, things started off well, but we ran into some bumps along the road. We realized that there was a huge disconnection and language barriers, if you could understand. There was confusion and a lack of support regarding the meaning of Black Lives Matter. there was usage of certain vocabulary to describe the Black community that most of us would find very offensive. And so the outcome overall was not what we had hoped for, although we did discuss some ideas or ways that we could still work together in the long run. But we learned ultimately that this is going to be a long process, and there's a lot of work to be done. Like Danae mentioned earlier today, because of the systemic racism and the prejudice that's deeply ingrained in the fabric of our nation, it is going to be a little bit of a challenge for us in our area, and maybe in some areas as well. But this taught me a lot about the importance of channeling my frustration to create like effective change, right? So if you all face something similar, don't count it as a fail. You brought your chapter to the table, and so your voice was heard or will be heard. And so now, right now, we're moving on to Plan B.
Thank you, Evie. And to be clear, that some of the language barriers I think that were coming up, for instance, is someone referred to us as colored people. Now I understand that, I'm guessing he meant to say people of color, but the fact is he didn't. He said colored people. And when we started the conversation, there was a real hesitance on the part of the police. They didn't want to outright say, we don't like those Black Lives Matter people, but that's what it felt like to us. And so we had to be really clear with them that it wasn't an option for them to like or not like Black Lives Matter, that's just what it is. Black Lives Matter. And whatever myths they were believing about the movement, and for our calls for that our families matter, that people who look like us matter, that they were just going to have to move past it, because indeed Black Lives Matter and our families matter. And you've heard us say that over and over and over again. So that it was an interesting moment to explain to police that indeed Black Lives Matter. So
it was.
That was fun.
For lack of better words, yes. Yeah.
That was fun.
Yeah. Yeah. So a response from law enforcement doesn't necessarily mean that they're actually, on your side completely. There's just a lot of work to do.
There's a lot of work to do. Thank you, Evie. So guiding us some more through that work is our special guest for tonight, Dr. Tracy Kesey. Again, we cannot tell you how excited, Dr. Kesey, we are to have you on. And we're just calling you Dr. Tracy. Is that okay?
Tracy is just fine. So you don't have to, we have no formalities. My understanding, this is like being home in a conversation.
This is home.
It's just realness here. So,
right. And Tracy is real, y'all, so get ready. So I do want to take a moment though to explain who she is, and then she can give us more context. And this is going to be just a conversation between us. So I have a few questions for her, and then we invite the rest of you as our membership, right, to ask your own questions. You can put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we'll see you on all the pages. But just really quickly, for those who don't know, Dr. Tracy Kesey, that's the last time I'll say it, is the co-founder and senior vice president of Justice Initiatives for the Center for Policing Equity. And that's a research and action think tank that produces analyses identifying and reducing the causes of racial disparities in law enforcement. And she has graciously accepted our invitation to speak to us tonight. And so on that note, we will get started. Tracy, so you have seen our letter to police explaining that, look, we are not interested in this false binary, right? That folks are trying to force us into being either anti-police or pro-police, that we live very comfortably in both worlds. So we are daughters of law enforcement, wives of law enforcement ourselves, we are sisters of law enforcement, cousins, all the things, right? And we understand policing on the other end as well, right? We understand the way it lays a disparate burden on our lives and our bodies. And that's what we're talking about today. So we laid that out in the letter, and then we follow that up with a list of action steps we want to take and some demands. So we are supportive of the 8 Can't Wait campaign. and have specifically pulled out three specific areas and three specific demands that we're asking for. One is to ban the chokehold. The second is de-escalation, and the third is comprehensive reporting so that police officers don't just get fired when they've had some bad reports in their folders from one jurisdiction and then move to another jurisdiction. But first, before we even get into all of that, can you lay out the lay of the land of where we are? Because there's been a lot of talk of George Floyd specifically, and then a lot of talk about law enforcement. But we understand that what we're talking about is the culture of policing Black and brown bodies, right? So George Floyd died at the hands of police officers, and so many other people have. But Trayvon Martin didn't. Ahmaud Arbery didn't, right? But they died very definitely from this culture of racialized violence and policing Black bodies, whether or not the people committing the crimes are actually the police. So can you lay out first the groundwork of where we are right now?
Well, you did a really great job of sort of doing some of that. So, but first, let me back up and say thank you for the invitation and for all of the beautiful brown, Black faces I see, because I'm tired. And so you are giving me energy, and I appreciate that. Let's talk about what's really happening here, because I've had this conversation now for 3 weeks with a lot of folks who claim they know, want to help in certain ways, but clearly when you hear the remedies for what's ailing us right now, aren't really getting it. So this is about not just the policing of Black bodies, as so aptly put, and systemic racism. This is at every turn we can think of. So it not only does it impact us from a law enforcement perspective, if you look at what's going on with COVID in regards to healthcare, look what's happening with education, look what's happening in all of the spaces when we talk about just existing as a person, as a Black person, right? So when we talk about criminalizing bodies, it's criminalizing of our everyday existence in some spaces. So you've heard it reported where it's sleeping while Black, it is shopping while Black, it is all of those things and more. But I think what's important about our conversation today is really to get an idea of what we're talking about when we're talking about race and policing. We are talking about a structure that has its roots and its origins in slave patrols. You will hear, and oftentimes when you have conversations with police officers who've gone through the academy, history is not taught in that way, depending on where you live and your police agency itself. Typically, you'll hear a lot about Sir Robert Peel, how it came over from from our English folks across the pond. But when it arrived here in America, it became and it was shaped into something that was about controlling a group of people and making sure that they were compliant in those ways. From slave patrols, we go to Jim Crow. I think some of us are old enough to remember, even in school, the photos that we would see, whites only, Black only. The police uniform was very much a part of enforcing those types of things. When you talk about redlining, when you talk about all of those things that carve us out, there's always been a policing or a law enforcement aspect to that. So if you understand where that comes from, you can look at today and still see the same threads of the way folks are engaged, talked about, whether you met people of color or colored folks. I'm always somewhat about the slip of the tongue. We are in a space today that really has been coming for quite some time. And I say this in policing. My background is policing. 30 years in policing, 25 with Denver PD and 4 with NYPD. And so my work is really based in not just the intersection of race, but also gender. So when we talk about what's happening to our bodies, I would be remiss if I did not talk about our sisters, Breonna Taylor, Sandra Bland. When I hear all the names mentioned, what I don't hear are my sisters' names mentioned. And I'm always very clear about that. You should always lift them up. Even when people are talking about it, you should always insert it. I find places to insert it to make sure it happens. So it's all of us, but I want to make sure that we have that. What you see happening today in policing, It's not new. So if I take you back to after the civil rights, 1967-ish, 68, around there will be a report that you can look up, and you can, as my grandson says, you can Google and you can just find about just about anything you need. It's called the Kerner Commissioner Report. And when you look at that report and you read it, and you read the recommendations, that were just released at the president's executive order, those by, as well as our Democratic Party and the GOP, you're going to find similarities. In fact, you're going to find some of the same language that was written over 50 years ago in the same suggestions that are being delivered to us today, some a little bit more than others. The problem that we have with some of, not all, but what's being suggested, and I can tell you this from the conversations we've had with community, is that incrementalism is not what we're talking about. We have been fixing, and for, I don't know for all of you, but for the folks I talk to in community, reform is a trigger word. We have been reforming for quite some time. And what the ask is a complete, just obliteration of systemic and procedural racism. Not a program, but a complete redo, folks say reimagine, whatever word you want to use in that place, but what's being sold now is not, nobody's buying. And so part of that conversation then that I think we're going to have tonight is, what does that really mean, right? What does that look like? The one thing that I've been very clear about, as well as CPE, is this work will not go anywhere unless it is centered by community and driven by community. So the idea that we now are in a space where community, and we say this, not really defining what that means, but groups of people who are now in the streets on day 23 across this country and internationally, not asking for a program. They are asking for fundamental change. So the question becomes one of, and what a lot of groups such as Mocha Moms and other folks that I talk to are trying to think through is, what does that mean? We know we're not a monolithic community. We know that we've got folks that look like us that think ways in different ways, which is perfectly fine. But one of the things that we're going to have to start thinking about is there's a difference between policing and public safety. We want to be safe. And what that looks like and what that feels like has to be centered and driven by community. It's going to look different from community to community, and maybe as it should be. And I'm not talking about equitable, right? I'm talking about we should have what everybody else has, but we should also be able to talk about what that should feel like and look like in our communities. And so when we look at the work that's starting to happen now, especially now that we've got 3 different sort of documents outlining what reforms should look like, I always say to folks, make sure you read carefully and make sure you read between the lines. There are lots of things being suggested. There are lots of things being offered up. Some of it new, some of it not, some of it nuanced. One of the things that you all support are the bans of chokeholds, right? The outright ban and not use. If you read the bills closely, you'll have one that says, we'll ban it, but it's not our discretion, right? We are going to pay you to ban it. So, we're going to give you an incentive to do it. We have others that say, well, you ban it under certain conditions. So I'm going to allow the officer to make that decision yet again when that can be used or not, as opposed to just an outright ban. And so you really have to read those things closely to make sure they're lining up with what you want to support and what you want to make sure moves forward. But I want to make sure, though, the other things that you're supporting around de-escalation and reporting, those are critical. They're critical elements, but that's not all. And so I don't want folks to think if we just do these 3 things, then all will be right, right? What's happening now is a full onslaught of an examination of a system. That means everything's on the table. How people are recruited, how they're trained, how they're held accountable, whether or not they are disciplined versus fired. All of those things are on the table. And I would invite you all to be extremely involved. So it's not just ask the chief, tell the chief this is what we're demanding, but to get involved when you start hearing about, we're going to review training, we're going to do de-escalation. you should be asking, what does that entail? What does that look like?
Mhm.
And so there's plenty of places for folks to get involved in this. But I think we're getting behind certain remedies to this. You cannot lose sight. And I think you said it best. This is a process. And this is a long process. We didn't get here overnight. 401 years, we did not get here overnight. And so we're going to have to really think about and manage our expectations about how much time it's going to take to undo some of these things. And I'll give you an example. So for me, a chokehold when I came on the job was considered a best practice, right? So here we are 30 years later, and we're saying the impact it's having on a specific community, that can't be a best practice, right? So there's just some things you have to let go of. The other example that I give that's non-police, which everybody I think can relate to, let's talk about Aunt Jemima. I don't know about you, but I know that there have been people inside that corporation that have said, what are you doing with this? And so changing her photo, for those of us who are old enough to remember, right, from head rag to a nice hairdo was not it, right? But that's what folks believe. They believe, well, that's enough, let's leave it at that. And so now you have to ask the question, what is it about now and what's happening today that corporations now are sitting up and taking notice, and I guess finally listening to symbolism, to lived experiences, to historical experiences that are shaping our moments right now. But as I've had many conversations with folks over the last couple of weeks, what's happening in the street is not that. It is not a checkbox. It is not an offer up. It's not a program. And those that are donating money, glad that you can do that, but that is not a way, that's not going to get you out of the long run here. So I think that one of the things that has to happen in our conversation and as you move forward, it's going to be a long game. And that means you're going to have to be consistent and persistent about what the community is saying, what they want to have happen. And so I think it's equally important that we make sure that as you look at the policies that are being offered up, as you're having local conversations, because all policing is local, right? The federal government can only do so much. All policing is local. So as you're having those local conversations and just letting the chiefs and the sheriffs know you're here and you will be answering, that is a tremendous step where we have folks in communities that are still not ready to even take that step. So I applaud you for that in the letter as well. So I'm going to stop there because I think we want to do questions and have conversations around things. And so I'm going to stop and begin to entertain questions, or if there's something that I need to cover, let me know.
Great, thank you, Tracy. So we're going to invite you all to raise your hand if you can do that in the thingy on the platform, whatever that's called, technologically challenged. Don't laugh, LaShawn. Or write your question into the chat. If you could explain for us, Tracy, what exactly the Center for Policing Equity does and how it works, because I think this part of it is really fascinating as we begin to talk with our local law enforcement agencies, understanding that it's not just one conversation. Our first step is to open the door and open the line of communication.
That's right. And that's an incredible step. So the Center for Policing Equity's role is to help police departments through what we call justice through science. So we look at evidence-based and we look at data. And we do the analysis for police departments to help them get at where are we seeing disparity. So if you see disparities in traffic stops and pedestrian stops, then we go and do a deeper dive and we look at policies that may be guiding some of that work. And then we do even a deeper dive from a culture perspective of policing culture and begin to really get into, do officers understand what their role is and the impact they have on folks' lives? We do this for free for the police departments. All the chiefs have to do is invite us in. We don't go in any other way. We don't take money from cities and I think you all understand why we don't do that, because the community would see that as paying for a report. And so we do this at the behest of chiefs and also community, because communities have also gone to their chiefs and said, you need to participate in the following. So we've always been very grateful to the community for making sure that chiefs are aware of resources, because we are a resource to those chiefs and communities. And so we do that work. We're the ones that do the research. We are the ones that do the analysis. We provide recommendations that they can act on. And then through ComStat for Justice, which is our broader program, we actually help them do that work. We go in and we work with community, and we work with the officers. We work with mayors and council to help them figure out how do you get those things aligned so they can begin to interact and have better outcomes with the communities that they serve. We've been doing that 12 years. And when we started this 12 years ago, it was Philatiba Goff and I, as well as a few other folks, so it is from the heart. And I was doing this while I was in uniform and going to school. And so I think all of us here know, sometimes you do double duty as we do, but the passion for this is, as most of us are, whether we're partners, spouse, wives, uncles. I'm a nana with a grandson. And for most of us who are in that space right now, we have grave concerns still about how they're going to be able to move throughout the world. So this is what we do at CPE. We've got an incredible staff of researchers, former law enforcement, activists, analysts. And so we do this work from our heart and our soul. And it is something that we know needed to be done 12 years ago and will continue to be done until we do what we think we need to do to end all of what's happening to us right now. So thank you for allowing me to have that particular moment.
Great, thank you, Tracy. And I do have questions about that and how we engage our local law enforcement officials in that way, but there are questions coming in. I'd like to get to them before I lose them. So Mrs. Leverett has a question, and do you want to ask it directly or should I read it? She's asking in specific language and reactions when her 16 and 19-year-old sons are approached on foot or in a car by police officers. Are we telling our kids enough? Are we protecting them enough?
My goodness, that is a question that hurts all of our hearts. And what I've heard, moms say and grandmas and everyone else say is very appropriate. I wish there was a magic word that we could wrap around them and that would keep them safe and protected. Mm-hmm. But what you can do is what we're already doing, and that's having a conversation about what to do when you're stopped, right? To make sure that you are very articulate about what you're doing, the movement that you're getting ready to make, as best as you can, because if we all have been in that situation, it's a heightened situation. Folks are typically scared, they're nervous. And so it's really trying to, as best they can, to stay as calm as they can. But there isn't anything magic more than what you're already doing. And that is just making sure that they understand the importance. But what I also say to moms is when the kids do come home with a story or something that has happened, that you get after it, that you track it down and you find out if there has been any documentation of that stop, what has gone on, and that you have that conversation with whomever the officer was about the interaction that went on. So I usually that's where it stops. We oftentimes will have an experience. We try to definitely help them through the experience. But what I'm saying is that you should be circling right back and going to that particular department or that shift sergeant and ask what happened. What was the purpose of the interaction? And get that information. And that way it definitely is not just closure for you, because as moms and everyone else, it's closure for you as well. Because when they're bringing that back to you, you are feeling that. And you want to make sure that you have all you need to make sure that yourself, as you're educated as not just as an individual, as a family, but for your sons and your daughters as well.
Great, thank you. And there'll be a reason to come back to that one also. Miata, you had a question. I don't see you, but I'm looking for you. Miata?
Here.
Great, go ahead.
My question is, what have we done wrong in the past regarding trying to help the police department along with police reform?
I like the way you posed that question. And I wouldn't say wrong. I would say, what have we done that has not worked in the way in which we thought it should? And this goes back to my conversation around evidence-based policing, right? So when we do programs in policing, typically what we do, if we want to know if something is working or if officers think that particular instruction was good, we do a survey, right? And if the officer says, we love the class, we love the instruction, then we oftentimes will deem that as good. What we don't do is measure whether or not it's had any impact or change on behavior, right? Because what we're really talking about is that interaction, that behavior. And so what I would say, what we need to do differently, and what you're hearing in some of the proposals that are being brought up, is how do you measure that behavior, right? So if I'm going to have you take a de-escalation class, how am I going to know you're using what you learned in class? That's what we should be measuring. And then if we can tell those things aren't working the way that we think they should, we should be making the change. And so that's typically, it's not what's been happening, right? We keep training. Training is the number one thing you hear people say. Training is good from a skill set perspective, but if it doesn't change behavior, or if you have behavior problems with an individual, then all the training in the world is not going to fix that. And so we have to make sure that when we talk about, what's worked and what hasn't worked, there's been promising things along the way, especially around, community interaction, community conversations, but not enough. And so when you look at what else could we possibly do, one of the things that has to happen is we all need to be on the same page about what the problem is. And so if folks don't think there's a problem, then you're going to be over here. You're going to be here, you're going to be up here because you're off here, right? And so even with the example that Evie gave around language, right? Shared common language, shared understanding about what we're talking about here. Because you do have, most, not all, you have officers who don't know what they're seeing here, right? So they've been out on a skirmish line for 14, 15 hours, tired, exhausted, stressed, some angry. They don't know what they're seeing here. And so if you think about that internally from an organization, if you're not getting any information about what's happening, what's next steps, what are we supposed to be doing, then like most human beings, you start to fill those things in yourself, right? And you get that information however you can. But for the question, it is not necessarily what have we done wrong. It is really, do we know that what we were trying to do had an impact, a sustaining impact, and worked? And I think this time, the reason why you're hearing that it's got to be more than programmatic and more than just sort of incremental reform is because we don't have metrics on it, because we didn't. What we based it on was anecdotal that, we have a good relationship with Pastor so-and-so, so we must be good here, right? And so that kind of thing is what led us into some of those spaces where now we're standing in the street saying, no, that's not it. But all of it's on the table. All of it's on the table. And I appreciate the way you asked that question, right? So I wouldn't necessarily look at it as doing something wrong. Is like, do we know what worked and what didn't work? So yeah, I wouldn't carry that burden that way at all, because everybody most everybody has had a good faith effort in trying to do something. And there's lots of other factors involved in there. Most of you may not know that the average tenure of a police chief is 3 years, and you can't get anything done in 3 years. You can't make systemic change in 3 years. Every once in a while, you'll have one that's been around 5, 10, 25 years if you're a sheriff, but most chiefs don't survive that long, not long enough to make systemic cultural change. Thank you for the question. I appreciate it.
And it's interesting that you say that, because I'm remembering from our conversation in Burlington County with the police chief, when we asked about, so what are you doing to build trust in the community? Those officers kept talking in terms of, well, we're inviting people in the community in to understand policing. And I realized we were having two different conversations, because I was like, wait, we understand policing. Do you understand the community? Right? And so it took us about 45 minutes before we were even having the same conversation, because trust for them looked like, come on in and see what we're doing. And I was like, well, the reason there is no trust is because we're very clear about what you're doing.
Yeah.
Do you know what we're doing?
Yeah. So you can see if it took you 45 minutes.
Yeah.
Right. Just to get to what I hope was the reason why you were there. Right. So they understood that. But that's what we're talking about. And it's not just in policing as well. Right. So that in the criminal justice system per se, folks are on different wavelengths about what it means to for diversion versus, how do you make sure that the system is working to support folks that are coming through once they get out. So language matters here, and so does how do you define it. And EB gave an example. It's like, well, you have a problem saying Black Lives Matter, right? And it's like you're really trying to put this into something that it is not. And the example that I always give, I said, look at Colin Kaepernick. He was very clear about why he was on his knee. He never wavered. He never said anything about the flag. He never said anything about the military. He never said anything about not supporting America. He was all about police brutality. Here we are 2-3 years later, and we've got chiefs on their knees. We got cops on their knees. And the question is, do you understand why you're on your knee? Right? And not performance, not photo. And so it's one of those things where you also have to ask yourself, he was saying exactly nothing different than it's being said today, right? So there's this whole thing about whether you want to listen or what will make you listen. What will make you listen to what's being said? So, I mean, it's really interesting to tie all of those things together and, to hear things get co-opted, right? Anti-American, all of those things. And so yet here we are, and all of a sudden it's okay. And there's nothing different from what he said 2 years ago to what is happening today.
Thank you. So ladies, we see all of your hands raised and your questions, and we're just going straight through to get to them. Kim King is next. Kim, if you want to ask the question or I can read it. She's asking about how we tackle police reform in 18,000 different police departments across the country when everyone has different regulations and policies.
No, that's the challenge of the day, isn't it? So part of what the federal piece is trying to do is create some oversight for those police departments. But as I said before, policing is local, right? So even though the federal government may have, for example, a registry for officers who've been fired or quit before they were fired or convicted, right? So you can have one on the national level that everybody can sort of go and hopefully look at. So when they're hiring people, they can check against that. There's also, though, a real push on the state level to make sure that gets done. But the question is 100% on point, because the conversation is, how do you do that? Some folks would be surprised that some cities don't even have certification of officers, right? That they don't have a system in which officers can no longer be a police officer. And you have to look at how legislation and state laws were designed and written, because a lot of the work too is on the local level. But it's a great question, and that's the question of the day. How do you do that? And there is a push to do like a national, and what they're saying certification, but what they mean is they want to have a third party come in and certify a police department to say that you are, a gold standard. But the question becomes, and who's making the standards? Who's making the determination? Mm-hmm. And if community is not a part of that process, then all you're doing is moving off accountability to a third party, right? So the community is not even going to be able to have the accountability conversation because it's in the hands of a third party person. So it's a great question, but that's one of the challenges. The challenges is, how are we going to do that? And that's part of the broader conversation. So when I come to, if you come to Denver, you should be held to some unifying standard if you were going to drive to Mississippi. And so that is what a lot of the conversation is about. And I urge that you all get in the middle of that and really raise and lift your voices on that. But that's a lot of those conversations are happening right now. And they're going to play out, I guess, on C-SPAN in Congress. So.
Thank you. Tiambe, you have a question. Tiambe Richardson.
Hi, thank you. My daughter is 6, and she talks a lot and asks a lot of questions about George Floyd. And I want to know, like, what is the right age to start talking to them about that? And also, I'm not sure, she might be ADHD. The school is telling me she's too young to give me a diagnosis. But then if she is someone who would have that kind of hyperactivity, how would I talk to her about that in terms if she gets older, when she gets, you know?
Yeah, that's the tough part. So you are going to have to determine when your baby's body, right? We know, at what point we have to start having that conversation. And so, but I want to also tell you, if she is on any kind of social media, and if she is, like most of our children, very observant and listens very well, she's already heard the name and she knows something bad has happened. And so if you have an opportunity without trying to traumatize more, right? So it's never our intention, but it does create extra anxiety. So you have a sense of when you're ready to have that conversation. And I would say, and this is what I also tell folks, depending on what kind of pediatrician you have, right? Get with the pediatrician and talk about, we know this is a thing for all of us, the stress, the additional anxiety around moving through spaces. Definitely get with a pediatrician and say, I need to figure out a way to do that. And, and if she's definitely has, an attention deficit disorder, we also know our kids can be overdiagnosed as well, right? And so you want to make sure that it's not the stress of what's going on around her that's doing that. And I always say, and I've told my own daughter this, get a hold of the pediatrician. If you have one that is pretty well studied, they should know that you should be coming to them with, let's make sure that there's really untapped mental health issues happening with our own children, right? So they're being exposed, they're hearing it, we're trying to protect them as much as we can, but you have to be able to gauge when it's time to say, ask the questions, right? Get with their pediatrician and say, do you know who George Floyd is? Do you know what happened? They'll help you sort of guide you through those things. And I think it's important that you monitor and you watch, because sometimes they'll ask the question in a different way, but they're trying to get to something else. Right. And so best, what's going to work and what age you think is appropriate. And I always say, make sure that everybody in the house is monitoring and making sure everybody's okay. And then definitely get with the pediatrician and say, look, I'm going to have this conversation. My daughter had to have it. My grandson turns 10 in August. She avoided it like most do as much as she possibly can. She tried to ride that sort of balance wave between good and bad. His grandparents were police officers. And so it's one of those things, though, as mothers, it's a conversation had to be had, but she had to gauge when she thought he was ready. And because everybody else around him was talking about it, right? You can't pretend like he's not here, he or she's not hearing those things. And it's a hard thing to do. And it's hard on you as well. It's hard on all of us. So make sure that we not only care after our kids, but you practice self-care as well, as much as you possibly. So definitely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tiambe. Cicely Benjamin, I hope that I pronounced your last name correctly. Cicely?
Okay. Hi, it's Bing like a ring. So hi, Dr. Kesey. I am in California, and we recently in the past few years passed the Racial and Identity Profiling Act, which requires officers to collect identity information when they make stops, just stops. So not even talking about arrests. And it's being kind of rolled out on a rolling basis. It hasn't hit all of the departments in California yet, but I'm just curious, in your work, have you seen any, because the theory is, it kind of would disincentivize these kind of frivolous, discriminatory stops by making the process very cumbersome for the officers. That's the theory, right? I'm just wondering, in your reality or of states that you may have studied that have similar legislation, is it making a difference? Are we seeing numbers change at all?
Great question. So what helps with the reporting is it allows us to see what's going on, right? So it'll point to certain areas and certain types of things that are going on that allows us sort of to focus in on if there's a certain portion of a neighborhood where a tremendous amount of traffic stops are being made. So you can look at broad trends across places. So there's two conversations around what you're asking, right? So typically, part of the pushback for wanting to collect data is that it would take too long administratively, right? That means that I'm going to have to pull over, I'm going to have to fill out this form, and then I'm going to have somebody sign off on it. Most police departments, not all, and I always never say absolutes, most police departments have automated this function. So it is not as cumbersome if you think it is. When we did it 25, 30 years ago, I had to fill out a Scantron card. For those of you who are old enough to remember taking a test, number 2 pencil, I had to fill out a Scantron card for every stop. I complained about that. right? And when I look at what officers have now, it is literally what we're all looking at each other on, and that is putting it in, right? Doesn't take long, drop down menus. So that's an old one that folks like to hold on to, as well as, we could be catching criminals, so those are some of the same narratives that you have as well. So as far as whether or not it has an impact on folks' behavior and frivolous stops, it has some of that effect, right? But not enough to where you see the numbers dropping. There's always a drop off when you introduce data collection processes like that, because there is this getting used to it, some not wanting to do it, depending on the rules that are around it. So you will often see a reduction in tickets and a reduction in interactions, which in a lot of cases are not that bad, right? So when we think about some of the narratives that you hear around why we have to make what we call discretionary stops, because that's the first way of breaking up crime. And if you think about what's happened over the last 3 months of COVID, where lots of police departments stopped doing low-level interactions, crime did not go up. Where crime did go up, though, are on property crimes, right? And there were some violent crime raises, but on low-level stops where a lot of folks are getting that contact, you didn't see a rise there. So there's a lot of things that have disproven this conversation around, well, if we do this, it's going to keep us off the street and things are going to happen. It was the same sort of narrative that was around stop and frisk when New York had to start collecting that data, right? That, crime's going to be out of control. We're not going to be able to do it. And you saw drops, right? Just drops for the better. And crime didn't go out of control. So, we know that some of those narratives have already been debunked. Some of it is about accountability. And I have to, though, also say, some of it is administrative. It depends on the size of the organization. Most of police departments are 100 persons or less. If you don't have the technology, then it does become a bit of an administrative job. And there's only 3 of you patrolling, it does. So you really have to look at where we're trying to introduce that and what are the other sort of factors around it. But as far as, everything just goes away, that's not the case. And it's a great question. And you should just monitor that. You should keep an eye on that as well.
Wow, 10 people or less. That's bananas. So the next is GB Mochas. You have a question? I don't know who that is though. GB Mochas, your hand is up. Well,
hi, it's
great,
can you guys
great.
hear
I
me?
was about to skip you.
Sorry. Hey, Shantae Fields with the Greater Baltimore chapter.
Thank you.
So my question is, I always feel like police unions tend to be the stumbling block in any type of progression, especially when it comes to reporting or almost anything. What should we do? Or first of all, are they as much of a roadblock or a hindrance to change as I think they are? And if they are, what should we do to handle them moving forward?
Thank you. These questions are just phenomenal. So the question is whether or not unions are a hindrance. And I would tell you that unions can be a hindrance. Some unions more than others. And you also have some unions that are at the table that want to do the right things for their membership in the community. So you have both. You're on the East Coast. Let me tell you, that's a whole different animal. So as you move to Midwest and you start going up to the Pacific Northwest, they're a little bit different. However, the thing that you're thinking about is how do we, get to a group of folks who don't seem to want change? It's really in the collective bargaining agreement, right? So it is that particular document that outlines the benefits, the pay package. It tries to keep intact, management rights. It is that particular process where you see folks really beginning to pay attention to what's in those contracts. If you remember about a week ago, Chief Arredondo in Minneapolis during his press conference mentioned he was walking away from his contract, that he wanted to have attorneys and other folks look at it to make sure there were no provisions there that were keeping him from doing the necessary changes. That's the type of thing that you're starting to see now, to educate yourselves around how do police departments get raises? right? What's that process look like? We had this, same conversation this morning with a small group of folks who are focusing on this. And so things like the process of a contract, where in that process is there space for community input? And one of the things that was raised this morning was it's typically after the agreement has been done. Then by the time it gets to council or gets somewhere else for public hearing or public announcement, the deal has been made. And so there's no way for community to get in and say, yeah, no, we don't want that, right? And you have contracts anywhere from controlling when body-worn cameras are turned on and off, whether or not you can interview an officer that's been involved in excessive use of force. So there's a lot of things that different contracts do, and it's going to vary depending on where you are regionally and historically with that particular department. But the thing that you want to think about is how are those contracts put together, right? What's that process look like, and how much light is shown on that process? How open is it? How transparent is it? How do we know what you're, not just giving, but what other things are you allowed to happen in that space? So there's a lot of folks that have been doing that. I want to say, was it at Portland or Seattle? One of those up there, they did exactly that. The community put themselves in the middle of that process and demanded things to happen, understanding that we're talking about taxpayer dollars that are going to pay law enforcement. So there's a lot of conversations around how do you do that? How do you get in and have those conversations? So that's a number of ways. But I also have to mention, when you mention unions, I have to mention affinity groups, because inside most police organizations are Black police officers associations, Latino, Latinx police officers.
You said affinity groups?
Affinity groups.
Yeah. And there are groups there that represent typically smaller subgroups of folks that are present. There's also national organizations of both, right? National Organization of Blacks and Law Enforcement Executives, NOBLE, the National Black Police Officers Association. So there are these associations that you also can reach out to and say, how can we support you? What do you need us to do on your behalf? Because the interesting conversation as we talk about unions, which starting to now show up, is the experience of the Black officer, right? Because even historically, we were pegged as a fix for what's going on. And that language is coming up again. And again, you miss the mark, because it's not about who's there and who's representing. It's about the culture of what happens when those folks get in there. And so it's a lot of rich conversations about just that, right? So as I said, everything's back on the table, not just, how are they, unions involved, the structure, the militarization, all of those things are on the table right now. And those are the things that you talk about locally as well, right? So it's really probably the first time I've seen in my career, just a wide open, that we're going to look at just about everything you can think of in policing. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I was on a call earlier today, and I didn't even realize that apparently Maryland was the very first state to have a police bill of rights.
California has one too. There's a couple of states that have them as well.
Yeah, and it's almost like tying the citizens' hands. So I'm wondering, between the unions and obviously legislature, putting certain things in order, processes, procedures in order to kind of protect.
So you have to think about just what you identified, right? So if those things are put in legislatively on the state level, then you know what the strategy has to be. How you have to think about that, right? So if it was put there, it can either be amended or removed. But again, those take that kind of work to say, yeah, we're not good with that. And it's one of those things, again, that it's all up for discussion here, all of it.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Thank you. And Tracy, just so you know, we've got a lot of questions still coming in on the chat, so I may move it. I may move things really quickly, but this union question does relate to Robin Page's question from Hampton Roads, Virginia, our chapter there. And she's wondering, so you're saying that community can absolutely be a part of the conversation around not just recruiting, but the restrictions put in place by unions as well. Like we as a group of moms can be a part of that conversation And when we're talking to police chief, can we ask?
You should be asking, right? So what you need to know is, what is the process? What is the police contracting process? And someone should be able to walk you through what that process looks like. And the questions you should be asking is, well, when does the community weigh in, right? And if it's at the end, it's a little late. And so you really are going to have to learn, what does that contracting process look like? And it'll be more, I think, prevalent, because more folks are going to be asking these same questions, right? So when you have contracts coming up for raises and you have hearings, typically they go unanswered. And so it's really asking the question, what do those processes look like? The other question that I think part of the question was, you mean a part of recruiting? Absolutely, there's a place for community in everything. It's whether or not we want to have that happen, right? So in training, and what does recruiting look like, right? What happens when you are talking about something happens in a neighborhood, and how do you then come together as a community to support victims there? So there's lots of things that can be done, and there's things that haven't even been thought of that should be considered. Because what you're hearing too is, when you talk about, for example, a co-response model for someone who's in mental health crisis, which means you'll send a police officer and a clinician to that address. And the bigger question is about, why do you need a police officer to go to that address if someone is in a mental health crisis? It's a health crisis, not a law enforcement or a criminalization crisis. And so what the community is saying, put the money where it's needed, in mental health and education and just regular health care. And then some of these things will take care of itself, hopefully, because we still have to measure it, as opposed to, you need a police officer here, you need a police officer there. Here in Colorado and Denver, the school board voted to take the cops out of schools in Denver public schools in 2021. They're pulling them out, because the issue becomes one of, what is really going on in the schools? There's some underlying issues that are not being addressed, whether it's funding, whether it's behavioral, because there's something going on at home. The focus is not in the right place. And that's what a lot of the conversation is about in policing, is where should the focus be for police in a community?
Great, thank you. It's quicker if I call on you than try to read and ask your questions. So Sherelle Gordon, if you could ask your question very quickly, you're next.
Yes, thank you. Mocha Moms from Loudoun County. My question is about holistic health and community and police. I'm interested to know, is in training, where does the atmosphere of fear come from when policing? And then is the standard of community to come up with a plan kind of the one and done? Some of my students are asking, what if we get the plan wrong? And are we held to a higher standard or accountability of that? So first question, are you all trained around the atmosphere of fear? And then how do you regulate in responding to a plan when we're still dealing with racialized trauma every day in this violence? How is the expectation that we should know what we need when we're still trying to deal with the experience of racialized trauma? Thank you.
I'm gonna take the last one first, because that's critical, right? So what has to happen, and this is what is really sort of popping up all over there. Do you get a sense there's a rush to try to fix this? And so if you don't deal with that trauma, if you don't unpack and help folks heal from that, you're 100% correct. Whatever you come up with is not going to really be able to address what has happened. And so part of that conversation, as far as holistic healing, that has to be a part of this process. You cannot go from this to a 16-point plan and then forget all the rest of what's happened. That's what's been happening historically. So holistically, 100% correct. The other part too about this holistic piece in trauma is having those folks who can help people in the community, right, at the community level. So if I need assistance, or if I need to go somewhere where I can talk to someone, I need to be able to access that close to home. So it is great. And that is something that's not being talked about. What you are hearing is a jumping over of that point straight to the solution. And that's the concern, right? The concern is we got a whole lot of stuff going on here. We've got collective grieving. We've got anger. We've got all kinds of anxieties happening, and you've got to call it out, and you've got to begin to help healing with that. So you're 100%, that's one of the main things, but you don't hear it. And that's why Mocha Moms, you should be raising that. It's like, we can't just jump to a solution because it makes some folks feel better because they don't like being in this space right now, right? And so what we say a lot to a lot of our folks in policing is that don't be in a rush because you can't fix it. It took 401 years to get here. You're not going to get out of this overnight. You need to be in the moment and listen. And as uncomfortable as it is, let that help you understand what is happening here. So yes, and you have to continue to raise that. And we have folks on the ground throughout the country who are our health providers in the community who have raised the same issue and continue to raise it. And if you also know, anybody who's on the ground doing this work, they're typically the least funded, last funded, or not funded. That's the other thing. And that's where you hear the community talking about, you're putting money here, you need to put that money on the ground where people can get to it, where they can get the services that they need. And that's the conversation that it's had. On the first question, the first part of your question about the atmosphere of fear, thank you for that question. What typically happens in training historically is that there's an overemphasis on certain things. And typically what has happened is that you will train to an extreme, right? So you just need to go home safe every night, right? You just need to make sure you get here alive. And so when you continually reinforce that there is this level of fear when you go out, but specifically in certain communities, that's where it comes from, right? And then those things get reinforced. And so one of the questions that has come up, and I was over training for NYPD and also the training in DPD, is that there's an imbalance there where we should be talking about how do you engage, how do you problem solve, how do you identify that you might not be needed here, so you should just go and bring somebody else in here. Those types of trainings, those types of understanding have to be elevated, right? I can tell you that we spend an inordinate amount of time on firearms, and very rarely do officers fire their weapons. And we spend very little time on community, on history, on understanding why the relationship between communities of color and other folks are problematic. And so it's one of those things where there is an imbalance and it's recognized. And as I said before, everything is on the table. Everything is on the table. So.
Thank you.
Thank you. Rosalind Peterson is asking, do you believe police should be licensed like other professionals? And Miriam Cook, you're after Rosalind's question.
Yes.
So, yes, you do believe police should be licensed like other professionals. Great.
Yes, there's got to be rigor to that. Yes.
Miriam, go ahead.
You're on mute.
Miriam.
Sorry.
That's okay.
All right, my question is trying to figure out, our rights as citizens. Like, how do we find out that information about, what are their policies for our local police officers? Like, what rights do we have in our homes, in our cars? Like, I would love to know how to even access that information.
So a lot of your rights are protected under the Constitution, and there's other places. But if you're talking about not just that, but policy, some departments have their policies posted online, and most, not all, you should be able to go to the police department and say, can you give me your policy on training? It should be public. There are lots of different forms you can go to understand what your rights are, your Fourth Amendment rights on search and seizure. The right to remain silent and not, incriminate yourself. So there's lots of places that you can go and you can get that information. What you want to make sure, though, and this is what I tell folks, what you want to make sure is not only when you understand that right, you also then will understand the conversations you're having with officers, right? So if you are being asked to do things, to be searched and to allow people into your home without reason, you will clearly understand that that can't happen. right? And so you absolutely have to educate yourself. So most policies, not all, and you can get a sense of, I still tell folks, if your police department policies are not posted, then you certainly can go and just do a Google and you can look at other large department policies. They usually run similar. There's very, either it's more restrictive or they're more loose, but it will give you a general sense of idea of the kinds of policies that departments have around certain things. So you can go, if your department doesn't have it, you can go look at, NYPD, LAPD, their stuff is posted online and you can look at it and you can just say, oh, that's what it looks like. Most of our policies run about the same. That's otherwise we wouldn't be having a national conversation about chokeholds.
Great, great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Chanel Garcia, you're next. Chanel?
Hi, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
We hear you.
Yes, thank you. So I'm Chanel Garcia from Maryland, and my question was specifically on the police departments have been pretty quiet in regards to like Black Lives Matter and police brutality. In your experience working with police departments, what is their opinion or attitude regarding what's going on today?
Well, I would tell you this right now, most officers, not all, are in shock. They don't necessarily know what they're looking at. They're not understanding what's happening because a lot of them, and not all, but a lot of them who just go to work every day, do a good job, are polite, are very professional, are not understanding it. When we talked about there being two sort of different languages, the language of, well, we do coffee with the cop, we give out bikes at Christmas. We don't understand why that's not enough. And again, it's not one in which they don't want to say something, is that right now they are demoralized. They have watched one of their colleagues murder someone on television. They're being compared to that particular person where it may not even apply to that individual person. And a lot of them don't have the language to be able to talk about what's happening. It's not as if the conversation's not happening internally, because they are. They absolutely are. And it's one of which, if you think about officers and how they communicate with one another, and how you hear, a lot of folks always talk about, the thin blue line, or people who won't, say anything. There is a culture there. And right now the culture is being challenged and people are trying to figure out, how do I now fit in here, and what's happening to us? So that's what you're seeing right now. You're also starting to see folks who are a bit angry, right? You've got in Minneapolis, cops have quit there, and other places people are like, don't show up for shifts. So you're starting to see some of that, but you have to take that for what it is. It's not all, it's some. And so much like people, react and grieve in different ways, you're going to see those same kinds of reactions as well. Just because you're not hearing it outside publicly doesn't mean it's not happening inside the organization. And it absolutely is happening inside the organization.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Cheryl Hill Merriman, are you ready for your question, Cheryl?
Yes.
Great, go ahead, really quickly.
Oh God, wait a minute. I'm trying to remember what my question was.
You were talking about police officers as part of reform.
Yeah, my question, like anything, as even a person who wants to be a doctor, a person who wants to be an accountant, we all go through training and, 3 or 4 years training. And I noticed a lot of, will you please stop, Joel? Be quiet, I'm talking right now. I'm sorry.
Mom life.
That's right.
And I just wondering, we were talking about training, and I know a lot of this information, the way they're acting, the racism, bias behavior sometimes has to do with maybe how they've been raised. But my question is, do we think that maybe we should increase the amount of training? Maybe they'll give it more time for them to learn about, sociology and how to react to certain people. And I just don't think they have enough time. And I think sometimes they're overworked they're doing some of the jobs that maybe social workers should be doing, or psychologists should be doing, or other behavioral professionals. And I think they may be overworked. So I'm just wondering, how do you feel about that? I mean, do you think that may help to some degree, having more time to,
Yeah. Well, so there's been a lot of suggestion around doing what we call, we've heard folks say they should be licensed,
right?
But doing like you have, not just with doctors, like nail technicians go through more certification process than a lot of folks do, right? And so if you think about, most academy classes are 6 months long. After that 6 months, there's another probably 2 to 3 months in what we call field training, where they're riding around with a senior officer who sort of grades that behavior. So there's been a lot of questions, one, of whether or not should the academy be longer. It depends. Should they go out and then come back? So some of those models have been tried, but probably the larger question is, should police officers have college degrees? Because right now, most places, you only have to have a high school diploma. And so part of that package piece then becomes one of, even if you were to extend, let's say it took you 4 years to become a police officer, right? Like most apprentices do when you're doing some type of work. Then what you would want to do in that space, which I'm saying everything's on the table, right? So what you would have to also think about is that there's a cost associated with that, right? So if you want to invest and train and make sure you hold people accountable and have pathways to move people on who should be there, there is a cost to that. And so I hear you in regards to, let's do something that's more graduated. I would say what we probably should be doing is looking at the curriculum of the academy, right? So there may be things that are missing completely that you may want to get at. And so there's been a lot of studies, whether it's 6 months where we've done like 3 people go out and come back. So there's been different ways to do it. But I think what you also have to keep in mind about should training be longer is, do you have the right people? Because that piece has to happen up front when you are hiring and doing assessments and trying to determine, do you have the right disposition to do this job? And then as you go on your career, things happen to you. You should also be going back to the psychologist and making sure that everything is okay. So I do sure I like the idea of that, but it would have to be some combination of, because I don't like to put everything in the training bucket, because you're bringing people into that space and you want to make sure that you're not just hiring, but have the right people, but you have the right job that you want them to do, right? So I'm in agreement that police over the last decade or so are taking on positions and jobs they shouldn't be doing. And it's typically because they're the only entity up 24/7, 365 days a year. And for mayors and everyone else, if something needs to happen really quick, they look to the group that's always moving and working, right? So if you think about policing social distancing, how did that make sense? To have officers out telling people to break up the party, right? If it was a health issue. So there are some of those things, but I like the idea about training. But again, all of those conversations are going to be happening locally, where you have regional academies and you have departments that have their academies. They're having the conversation now because the training pieces come up as de-escalation. A lot of cities already do de-escalation. So the question becomes, if it's not de-escalation and if it's not training, what is it? So I absolutely like your question. I think there's room for all of that, and it's going to vary depending on the ability for the departments to create that training or whether or not they share one with the state. And so, but each of those academies have state certifications around them, right? So there's certain things that the state can dictate, classes those recruits can take. So you don't have to extend it. You can go in and say, I want to see what courses they're taking. And you can begin to add courses in, or you can suggest or ask to sit in on what they're learning about the community and who the community is and the history of community. Because we see a lot of departments going through that. As folks that are up in the, the DC, Baltimore area, the conversation came up at one of the press conferences, well, they should go to the African American Museum. It's like, yeah, that's right, but that's not all. Right. And so we're going to be very careful about how we talk about training. But Cheryl, I like the idea of looking at something that may be a little bit more extensive, but it's really looking at what they're being taught now and seeing if you need to go in there and redo some of that work. So thank you for that question. I appreciate that.
Tracy, it's 10:23. We typically try to get off at 10:30, but we have a few more questions. So can you stay on a little longer to get through these questions?
As long as you all are staying up with me, I'll stay up.
Okay, we're going to get through. Thank you. Femi, you're next.
just
Tiffany, you're
unmuting
muted.
myself. I'm
Perfect.
just unmuting.
There you are.
Thank you. So apart from voting, what tangible steps can we take to ensure local police departments are not only hearing us, but also implementing our asks? So whether it be, the 8 can't wait suggestions or some of the other things that you've sort of discussed tonight, how do we move from having a dialogue to creating accountability outside of voting?
A great question. You do that by staying engaged with the police department, right? So even if you said, like you have all said, these are the 3 things we want to have happen, right? So even if you ban the chokehold and do more data collection and do de-escalation training, what then you should be doing is going back and making sure those things are still in place, even if you get a new chief. And you also want them to begin to produce reports around this work, right? So there has to be a way to report out. You can't hold people accountable to what you don't know, right? And so you really want to put those pieces in place where you say, okay, you're going to implement de-escalation training. That as a community, what I want you to do is report back to us how they were trained, when they were trained, give us the curriculum and let us look and see what you're talking about, right? Who does the training? Who's involved with the training? And then what you also want to know, and this is part of the data collection piece, is who's using the training. Don't you want to know if you're training them, if they're using it? And if they're not using it, then it's up to the community to say, as instances are showing up on body worn cameras, well, why didn't they were trained? Why didn't they use it? That's how you do that. That's how you continually keep, but it's consistent and persistent, right? And you'll be able to notice when things start to sort of feel like they're moving backwards. You should always be asking questions. You should be showing up to community meetings. You should be hosting your own meetings. You should also be engaging in a way, and this is the other piece, when you're selecting chief, right? I tell you how many times cities have gone through the selection of a new police chief or the election of a sheriff, and no one pays attention to it. They have an evening where they want you to meet the candidates, and nobody is there but the candidates. That's what you're going to have to get in and sort of stay in that. And again, you can't carry that burden alone. That's why there's all of you. And there's a way to begin to do this, as a group. Somebody's responsible this amount of time. Circle back. Let's put this in our meeting notes. Did anybody go back? We're at a 6-month checkup. So you can actually design a cadence for checking in, right? To make sure things are done beyond voting. You can go back and ask, pay attention when city ordinances are up for review or being questioned or pushed or introduced. And that way you do become a lot more, not just engaged with that, but you almost become your own legislative affairs, right? But you can continue to check and hold people accountable, but that's the way it's supposed to be done in a democracy, right? I'm in it, I want to hear it, I want to see it. If I don't, I'm back at it. And it is a combination of the voting and making sure that you're paying attention to what they're doing as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ivory McGee, you have a question from Tampa. Ivory?
Yes, I'm here.
Great. Go ahead, Ivory.
Okay. I live in what I have found to be pretty racist area. Didn't know that when I moved here, but I had just mentioned that, well, I just found out we have a neighborhood chat. So my neighbor said she was out walking with her family, African-American family. Some white teenagers drove by and yelled, "White power," and scared her children, scared her husband, scared her. So they just went home. And she said it, mentioned it on the neighborhood Facebook chat. And some people were like, "Oh, it'll be okay, it was just random." And then we also have a big, huge Confederate flag on our highway, which they're petitioning to take down, but they took it down during the protesting because they didn't want it to get damaged, and then they put it back up. So living in this type of area, how does one safely address police issues? Because there are police issues. There have been reported police issues with African Americans being harassed and things of that sort. How does one go about approaching, addressing these issues safely.
Well, your safety is the number one thing, right? So most agencies, not all, have forums just like you could send an email and you can text people, and you can also, make sure that you get the chief's address, email address, you can call in, you can do this piece, you can have someone go on your behalf, right? You can proxy if you don't feel safe enough to do that. But the key here is for you to be safe. There's plenty of ways in which you all did it. Now you wrote a letter and you sent it out. Same thing. If you have send a letter and send it out to your network and say, this is what's going on. So you can have that pressure apply in different ways, and not just you. Then you can sort of activate the group that's here. And then all of a sudden you've got folks calling in, writing in and saying what's going on. So, but the key for you is to be safe, right? And it's not your role to put yourself in danger to get somebody else to change their behavior. But there, the advent now of social media and of, sending emails and the good old fashioned phone call, you have all of those things available. It's being persistent and consistent, right? And you activate everybody around you and let them know what's going on. I mean, I think everybody's got next door, right? You bombard next door and say, this is what's going on. Not necessarily looking for empathy, but for awareness, right? Just be aware that this is happening.
It's interesting you say next door, and I'll end here, but the next door chat has been shut down so many times because of the racist remarks that people are saying to each other, and we're neighbors.
Yeah.
So
and the safety of your home, right? And the safety of your home. But you have a network right here with you, right? And all you have to do is send it out, and they will activate. But the key here is for you is just to be safe. Be safe.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ivory. Joby, you were next. I just saw Joby and was talking with her. Joby? Okay, then we'll go to Kim G. You were next. You were after Joby.
Okay. Hi there. We are in upstate New York in Rochester. And so I guess sometimes it feels like it's challenging to know what a meaningful next step or practical step is going to be. And I was just curious on hearing your thoughts about, for example, if we find, if there's a local organization that's already sort of working at holding police accountable or holding like local officials accountable, what are your thoughts on sort of rallying behind those organizations versus like 10 different people trying to find 10 different paths? You know what I mean?
I do.
Sometimes and how would we go about finding the right folks to sort of rally around and join so that, there's kind of strength in those numbers versus me going over here and someone else going over there, sort of.
Yeah. And you want to make sure that whatever group you find is in alignment, right, with what you want to have happen. And it doesn't make it a bad thing that if you have someone who's already started that work, for you to sort of go into that work as an observer to see what's happening, and you may be able to enhance what they're already doing. But there's always local chapters of old, what I consider the old staples like the NAACP, the ACLU, but there's local places. And so usually if you keep your eyes open on social media, you'll be able to find, we're having a meeting here, we're having a rally there. Some of it is just going, so you can hear and get a feel for what folks are trying to do, right? There's absolute need for folks who demonstrate. There's a need for that. But there's also folks who want to get into the policy space, who want to show up at hearings. And it's just really a matter of looking on what's going on in your neighborhood and going and actually attending a couple of the meetings. A lot of times you don't know until you go. Sometimes it's only going to be 5 people, right? You might be number 6. But I think you get a good sense of whether or not folks are about the business as opposed to, standing around talking. Then you'll be able to say, I'm going to go in and join in and help with this. But you're going to have to go to a couple meetings and see if it's a good fit. And if not, it's okay for you to say, I'm going to do this one by myself. It's absolutely okay. There's always strength in numbers, but there's nothing wrong with, if you are leading a charge on this, then you're leading it. And then everybody else can just join you on it. So if it's there and it's available and you feel good that they're going to do what you think is going to be important, you absolutely go ahead. But there's absolutely nothing wrong with you saying, I'm just going to do this one by myself and just go ahead. Or gathering other people around you who have the same piece of issue or same thing that you want to address. So you don't have to join, you can also create your own. So I think you could do all of those things and more.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kim G. Kim King had a question. Kim King, are you with us still? Kim King. Do I hear you? How about Eleanor, who is suggesting that we have a truth and reconciliation process with police, like happened in South Africa with apartheid? What do you think of that?
I think you have to heal some folks first before you can do it. You got to be in a space to really have an agreement on what the truth is. And there's, if you remember South Africa, that was a long process, and folks in South Africa will tell you they're still going through it. And I think that we will get there, but right now, if you look at where we are, if you're in a neighborhood, you get on next door and you're reading what's happening here, we have not had a full fleshing out of what we're all experiencing and what we're going through. I think there is a place for that, but I think before we can get there, we got to go through this, and we have to help folks heal, and they have to understand what's going on. So I think there is a place for that. I just think that it's a little bit further down the road.
And maybe it's bigger than just the police, right?
It's got to be bigger than the police.
Tasha Vanderpool. Tasha, do you want to ask?
Yes,
or you
I'm here.
Good.
Hello, good evening, ladies. Good evening, Mochas. Dr. Kesey, thank you so much for your knowledge. I'm learning so much from you. Thank you. I did have a question. And by the way, I'm Tasha. I'm from Howard County, Maryland. My question for you is, what are your thoughts on qualified immunity policies for officers? Do you think it would be a good idea to remove qualified immunity? And what would the potential impact look like?
Wow, that's a great question. And for qualified immunity for folks, it is a protection officers get in the performance of their duty that keeps them from getting sued.
Right.
In some cases, civilly, you can still get sued. So most states, you'd be surprised in the last 2 weeks, there's been a lot of states that have already gotten rid of qualified immunity. They've just gotten rid of it. And so you're going to have some kind of protection. The question is to what level, right? And under what circumstances? That's really what we're talking about here. You will have people who will say, to your question, Tasha, that if you don't have 100% protection against, whatever you do as an officer, good or bad, you're not going to get anybody who wants to be a police officer.
Exactly.
And that's not true. Let me be clear. It depends. Okay. No, it depends on the reason why you're going into the business, right? There's mistakes, and then there's just flat out negligence, right? So it really depends on what you're going into the business for, but it also depends on what you want your police officers to do, right? So if you think about the reason why you have qualified immunity, this is a group of people who have the legal authority to take a life. No one else has that power. And so what you want to think about is, if you want to remove it and folks are saying we need it, you need to ask the question, why do you need it? And why do you need it in that absolute, right? And so what the community then should be talking about is, let's go back and look at what are the duties and responsibilities we're asking you to do. Are we putting you in positions where you think you need to be this way and have this in order to function? And what I say is, even as an officer, things are going to happen. We know that, right? And I think most of us understand that things do happen. But what we're having a problem understanding is why the same things consistently seem to be happening here. And so I think that the qualified immunity question is the conversation you're having, right? You've got one group that it's a non-starter. And then you have another group, it's like, would it be a non-starter? And why do you need this level if you're supposed to be doing something different or not? We're not expecting you to do something to that level. So it's a good question, but what you will hear is that, well, nobody's going to want to do this job. Well, I would think that if that were the case, you'd have people who wouldn't want to be doctors,
Right.
So I mean, it is a conversation that needs to be had, right? And a part of that is you need some protection, but do you need that level of protection? And I think that's the question. So yeah, and it will be discussed for months, right?
I think it would help keep people, officers, accountable for their actions. I think it would be a deterrent to some of the abuses of power that we're seeing.
Yeah, I think it would be in some cases, and in some cases it may not matter at all. And I think that's what we're trying to solve for, right? Is like, what's going to keep you going on the right way and interacting and doing the work professionally. And, you know, that particular piece was to protect people so they could do those kinds of things. But like as everything else, like a chokehold, all things need to be revisited, right? There isn't any reason why we shouldn't be having that conversation. And there really shouldn't be called a non-starter. It's like, then if we're serious about what we're trying to do here, everything's on the table. And let's have that conversation in a way. But thank you for that question. But yeah,
Thank you.
We'll see.
And the last question of the night goes
Thank
to
you.
Miriam Cook. Miriam?
Sorry, I had this last question. You know, I feel like for police officers, you know, we know there's, you know, there's really good police officers, but I feel like sometimes they've, you know, are they put in this position where it's like, okay, you know, like this code of silence of like, okay, if I rat on my, you know, person, now how is that going to affect me? And if I do, then, you know, how's my chief? How are they going to react? So it's like, what kind of protections, like what can we do to help those police officers so they can feel okay with doing the right thing? Like, is there something in place to really help those good ones out?
I mean, it's a great question. And a lot of what you can do is publicly support those officers to do the right thing, but you also then have to hold that chief accountable for protecting that particular individual. Because we know this is true not only in a police department, but in a corporation, right? As soon as you're the one to step up, then all of a sudden things start going sideways. And so really protect people. Don't just tell me the protections are in place on paper. I mean, disrupt things that are happening, making sure that they are okay, and making sure you support publicly what has happened, right? Don't just fall back and let everybody else do it. But I think that one of the things, and this sort of came up yesterday during the charging in Atlanta, everybody was shocked when everybody heard that the officer was going to go state's evidence, right? When they said, well, you know, the other officer is now going to testify against the other one. And then 2 hours later, his attorney's on CNN saying, no, he's not doing that. And somebody asked me what happened. I said, I can tell you what happened. He probably got 250 text messages saying, what are you doing? Right? So those are the types of things when we talk about, you want officers, and everybody understand, everybody has a duty to intervene. You know, having to put this in writing, I just shake my head. We all have a duty to intervene, and we all took an oath to do that exact same thing. What you are finding from a culture is, and I'll tell you this from my own perspective as a Black woman, as a single parent at the time in a police department, I'm trying to make a decision if I'm gonna do the right thing or if I'm gonna pay my rent. Those are negotiations people make every day, right? It just so happens to be in a police department. And so the question becomes one of the environment and the culture of places have to be dealt with, where you have to even be to have that conversation with yourself, right? About, well, if I say something, I'm gonna be unemployed and I can't afford to do that right now, right? So I'm gonna figure out a way, you know, I might leak it or say something to somebody and hope it doesn't get back to me, or hope it gets taken care of a different way. That's the reality. And that's not just in police departments, that's everywhere. That's the reality. So being able to publicly do that support piece and make sure people are protected when they do it, right? And when the other person, people are, you know, are going sideways on it, they're the ones that get disciplined. They're the ones that are told you need to get a grip. So it's, you know, it's everywhere. And, you know, we want, and especially here in this particular profession, you want people to step up, but it's no different than anywhere else, because you do, it's a culture of one of you don't, you know, and that pressure. And if anybody's ever been in that sort of situation where the pressure of being isolated, right? Although you're present, but you're isolated and things start to happen, you know, there's more stress on top of that. So you start negotiating whether or not, you know, this is a way to go, and that's real. And if people are saying, well, you know, you should just step up, I'm like, let's be real. If anybody's ever had a job and you had somebody, a boss that you didn't care for, you are not just going to run in there talking about, I'm done, right? Because you had too many things going on. So it's really, how do you help people with that, right? That it's okay and your job's not in jeopardy. And that, you know, if you do this, you will be lauded for doing the right thing. And that's, you know, I have people say it, but I don't have people showing it. And I can tell you, this is where Black officers are coming from, right? They say, you know, you say you want me in the community, and as soon as something happens, I am I'm not a part of my community. It's the only group of people inside a police department that has to make that choice. You're either with us or you're against us. What kind of false choice is that? But it's reality. It's absolutely reality. So I love your question, but it's one of, you got to be vocal and you have to hold the chief accountable for supporting people who are doing those things. And they need to be lifted up when they do it. They need to be lifted up. And the folks who try to bring them down need to be dealt with.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it.
And thank you, Dr. Tracy, for taking the time to talk with us and go over time. We really appreciate it. This was very, very helpful. Thank you, Mochas, who were on the call tonight, getting engaged in this conversation. We will be having more of these conversations. We'd like to pull together a committee of us who are working specifically on these issues and how we approach them. So you'll be hearing more about that. In the meantime, have a wonderful evening. Dr. Kesey, get some rest.
You all stay safe.
Self-care is revolutionary.
Absolutely. That's exactly right. Absolutely. And feel free to call me anytime if you need anything else.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Have a wonderful
Absolutely.
evening. Get some rest.
Absolutely. You too.
Everyone, have a wonderful evening.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Good
Bye-bye.
night.
Thank you,
Yeah, everyone, good night.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Night. Thank you.
Did Quay disconnect? Okay, one moment.